Move on to votes for women. In this section about votes for women, we'll look at the suffragists and the suffragettes, the effects of suffragette actions, and why women got the vote. So how did women try to get the vote? Let's start with the suffragists and the suffragettes. There were two organisations, the Suffragists and the Suffragettes. Watch the following clip, then pause the tape and make notes of the methods used by the Suffragists and the Suffragettes.
The campaign for equal rights began long before Elizabeth Dean was born. During the 1860s, a few visionary women and men began to question women's limited opportunities and their complete legal dependence on men. By the turn of the century, some significant gains had been won. Women could keep their own property when they married, and a few girls' schools and colleges had been set up. Women ratepayers could even vote in local elections and become county councillors. But in the eyes of Millicent Fawcett, women could never achieve full equality until they had the parliamentary vote. Mrs. Fawcett and her suffragists led a sustained campaign. In 1903, a new group arrived on the scene, the Suffragettes. Impatient with the genteel tactics of Mrs. Fawcett's suffragists, they called for militant action. Led by the charismatic Emmeline Pankhurst, the Suffragettes devised colourful protests demanding votes for women, deliberately breaking the law in order to gain maximum publicity. Victoria Lydiard joined them in 1910.
At that particular time, Mrs. Pankhurst made a very big effort to have something very big done, and so it was a case of smashing of windows.
You should have spotted that the suffragists used peaceful and legal methods and the suffragettes used violent methods. The National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, the Suffragists, was set up in 1897. The leader was Millicent Fawcett. They held marches and organised petitions to try to get women the vote. Many MPs supported them, but the government wouldn't allow any time in Parliament to get an act passed. The Women's Social and Political Union, the Suffragettes, was set up by Emmeline Pankhurst in 1903. They began to use violent methods in 1905 because peaceful methods weren't working. Their methods gradually became more and more violent until Emily Davison threw herself under the King's horse at the Derby in 1913. This is the end of the section on the Suffragists and the Suffragettes. Now let's look at the effects of suffragette actions. Watch this clip, then pause the tape and make notes on the effects of the suffragette actions.
By 1914, suffragist organisations had over 100,000 members. But their peaceful approach made little headway against the male power structures of Edwardian Britain. And so, from 1903, Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters set up a rival, more radical organisation, the Women's Social and Political Union. These suffragettes argued, "Don't let's wait to be given the vote. It's ours by right. Let's take it. If that meant breaking the law, so be it."
Deeds, not words, is our motto. We want the vote, and we can see this so-called Liberal government is hostile to us getting the vote. So, we must fight this government until they are conquered or driven from office.
From 1903 to 1914, the suffragette impact grew. Mass rallies resulted in clashes with the police. Pankhurst and others spent time in Holloway Prison. They demanded to be treated as political prisoners. When this was refused, they went on hunger strike. They suffered force feeding. Not surprisingly, on their release, they were treated as heroes. Of all the publicity stunts of the suffragettes, the most famous and the most tragic was that of Emily Wilding Davison, seen here with the Pankhursts in a picture taken by Christina Broom. In June 1913, Davison went to Epsom. She mingled with the crowd. She pushed her way to the front as the horses approached. Her plan was to rush onto the course as the King's horse, Amner, approached, thus throwing the derby. A photographer from the Daily Sketch was standing opposite as she made her move. The photograph he took records what happened next.
Amner struck her with his chest, and she was knocked over, screaming. Blood rushed from her nose and mouth. The King's horse turned a complete somersault, and the jockey, Herbert Jones, was knocked off and seriously injured. An immense crowd invaded the course. The woman was picked up and placed in a motor car and taken in an ambulance to Epsom Cottage Hospital.
Emily Davison died of head injuries 3 days later. The suffragettes organised a spectacular funeral. 2,000 suffragettes escorted her coffin. But the more extreme their tactics, the more they alienated contemporary society. They smashed windows, they bombed politicians' houses, and the public recoiled.
Look at this. This is extraordinary. A suffragette given police protection from an angry mob. The scene took place in Criccieth in Wales in 1913. You read accounts of women caught by anti-suffrage mobs. She's in real danger.
A group of men fought their way towards us, and they played a kind of rugby football with us, pushing us into the arms of another group, who in turn pushed us on. 2 youths held onto my skirt so tightly, I feared it would either come off or I'd be dragged to the ground. Eventually, we managed to board a tram car, the crowd speeding our departure with a shower of cabbages.
By 1914, the debate raged. Were the suffragettes' tactics helping or damaging the cause? But then, such questions were swept aside by events on the European stage.
How did you do? You might have noted the following points. The suffragettes became more and more violent. In 1908, they began to throw stones and then went on hunger strike. They began to destroy property, even churches. Their violence began to turn people against them, and the government didn't want to appear to be giving in to terrorists. In 1911, the suffragette campaign became even more violent, and they began to attack property. They burned down the houses of politicians and destroyed churches. You should also know that in 1914 they slashed famous paintings such as the Rokeby Venus. The violence of the suffragettes began to lose them support. It's important to remember that in 1912 the suffragists broke away from them completely. As the suffragettes became more and more violent, the government didn't want to appear to be giving in to women who were behaving like terrorists. So that's the end of the section of the effects of the suffragette actions. So why did women get the vote? Watch the following clip, then pause the tape and make notes on why women got the vote.
While thousands of men lost their lives in France, the women were called on at home to volunteer for service too. They did heavy, dirty and physically dangerous jobs, which would have been unthinkable before the war. Many had their first taste of their own pay packet, and found they liked it. Mrs. Pankhurst abandoned her campaign for women's rights and threw herself into the recruiting effort. Her suffragette movement folded in an orgy of patriotism. Mrs. Fawcett's suffragists, while supporting the war, even sending nursing units to the front line, continued to press for the vote. In January 1918, their tireless efforts over 50 years were finally rewarded. Only a month after Armistice Day, all men, but only women over 30, voted in their first election. To the dismay of feminists, of the 17 women candidates, only one was successful, Constance Markievicz. But as a good Sinn Féiner, she refused to take her seat in the British Parliament. Elected in a by-election the following year, Nancy Astor became the first woman to take her seat in the House of Commons.
How did you do? You might have noted some of the following points. The suffragists and the suffragettes both called off their actions when war broke out and urged their members to support the war effort. You should also know that in 1915, suffragettes organised the White Feather Campaign to try to force men to volunteer for the army. In July, Christabel Pankhurst led the Right to Work March in London. More than 2 million women worked in war factories. Some made munitions for the army. This was dangerous work, and many women were killed in the explosions. Other women joined the armed forces or worked on the land. This convinced many people that they deserved the right to vote. You should also remember that during the war, many men lost the right to vote because they were sent to France to fight. You could only vote if you'd lived in Britain for at least 6 months. So in 1918, all men were given the vote at the age of 21 for the first time. This was a good opportunity to give women the vote as well. Some politicians were worried that the suffragettes might start their campaigns again. So women were given the vote at the age of 30 if they were householders or married to householders. So women were still not equal to men. Here's a typical question you might get on this topic. Why were women given the vote in 1918? The question's asking you to explain why. So to get good marks, you must sort the reasons into the correct order and explain how one led to another. It's also asking why women were given the vote, not to describe all the methods used by the suffragettes. So you wouldn't get many marks for just describing what happened. First, note down your main points, then spend about 15 minutes writing an answer to the question. Stop, rewind the tape, have another look at this whole section, and then have a go. So your plan for the answer should look something like this. The campaigns by the suffragettes and the suffragists, the work of women during the First World War, the loss of residential qualification for men, fears of a revival of suffragette activity. That's the end of the whole section on votes for women.